The British colonel had read every intelligence report on the position. He had studied the aerial photographs. He had spoken to the survivors of 4 failed attempts, 4, and listened carefully to each of them describe the same thing in different words. The ridge could not be taken. He did not argue with them. He had looked at the ridge himself and reached the same conclusion. What he had not yet done, and would not do until a junior officer suggested it almost as an afterthought, was ask the men standing quietly at the back of the briefing room what they thought. They had been standing there for 2 hours. Nobody had asked them anything. This is not a story about a knife. The knife matters, and we will come to it. But the knife is not the reason a fortified mountain ridge that had absorbed 6 weeks of Allied pressure fell in a single morning without a shot fired. The knife is the part people remember because it is the part they can picture. The blade catching the light. The sound of 60 sheaths emptying at once. What they forget, what the official histories tend to skip past, is the 3 months that came before it. The patience, the watching, the particular kind of intelligence that does not come from aerial reconnaissance or prisoner interrogation, but from men who had spent their entire lives learning to read ground the way other men read text. The Gurkhas of the 1st Battalion, 2nd King Edward VII's own. Gurkha rifles had been in Burma since the Japanese offensive rolled south in 1944, and the position in front of them, the one nobody could take, the one that had stopped every Allied unit sent against it for 6 weeks, was called Bishanpur. The Imphal Plain in Manipur sits at roughly 2,600 feet. Around it, the hills rise sharply, sudden, and dense, covered in jungle so thick that a man could disappear into it 10 yards from a road and not be seen from the air. The Japanese understood this terrain better than anyone in 1944. They had been moving through jungle for 3 years. The ridge at Bishanpur was not a large feature on a map. It was approximately 600 yards of high ground that controlled the only metalled road connecting Imphal to Silchar. Control the ridge, control the road. Control the road, and the entire Allied position at Imphal, already under siege since March, would slowly die of supply starvation. The Japanese 33rd Division had fortified it the way they fortified everything, deeply, patiently, with an understanding that defense in jungle meant layers, not lines. Bunkers were not placed at the top of the ridge where they could be seen and targeted. They were cut into the sides, positioned to fire across rather than down, their apertures facing ground that Allied soldiers would have to cross to reach them. Approach from the front, and you were walking into pre-planned crossfire. Approach from the flanks, and you entered terrain that Japanese engineers had spent weeks converting into a series of interlocking kill zones. 6 weeks, 4 Allied units, hundreds of casualties. The ridge had not moved. What the Allied commanders understood and what kept appearing in their assessments in different language was that the ridge was not being held by superior numbers. The Japanese garrison was estimated at between 200 and 250 men. The forces arrayed against it were considerably larger. The problem was not strength. The problem was geometry. Every approach the Allied soldiers could use was an approach the Japanese had anticipated. Every path that looked like an opportunity had been observed, registered, prepared. The ridge's defenders did not need to outnumber anyone. They needed only to wait for the moment when men appeared on the ground they had already decided to shoot. A British officer who had fought at El Alamein and would later fight at the Rhine crossing wrote in his diary during this period, "We are not losing to soldiers, we are losing to engineers. This hill was designed to kill us before we arrived." He was not wrong, but he was also not asking the right question. The right question was not how to cross the ground the Japanese had prepared. The right question was whether there was ground they had not thought to prepare. If you find this story worth your time, take a moment and subscribe. This channel exists for exactly these chapters, the ones that didn't make the front page, the ones that changed everything quietly. There are more of them than most people realize. The first, Battalion 2nd Gurkha Rifles, had been in the theater long enough that their reputation had developed a particular shape in the minds of the officers who deployed them. They were considered excellent at night operations, admirable in close country, dependable when the situation became what staff officers called fluid, which was the word used when everything had gone wrong and nobody wanted to say so directly. What they were not typically considered was a resource to be consulted on tactical planning. That was not how the command relationship worked in 1944. You showed Gurkha officers a map, you told them the objective, and they executed. Subadar Lal Bahadur Thapa was 34 years old. He had been soldiering for 16 years, the last 4 of them in jungle terrain that would end most careers within months. He had led night raids in Burma the previous year that intelligence officers had catalogued with a mixture of professional admiration and something closer to unease. He did not volunteer opinions, but on the 3rd day of observation, watching the ridge from a forward position, he was asked directly by a captain named Hargreaves what he saw. He looked for a moment longer than the question required. Then he said he saw a way up. What Thapa had noticed, what he had been looking at for 3 days while British officers studied the bunker apertures and the field of fire angles, was the jungle itself. Not the jungle at the base, not the jungle on the approaches, which had been cut and prepared and booby-trapped in ways everyone had already paid to learn. The jungle on the western face of the ridge, above the 40-degree slope that every tactical assessment had marked as impassable. Dense scrub bamboo. Vines that a man could not walk through without making noise. Rock underneath that had never been smoothed by a trail. Gradient that, on a map, produced a single letter in the margin. U. Unpassable. Thapa had not read it as impassable. He had read it as unguarded. There is a distinction that matters. Impassable means it cannot be done. Unguarded means the men on top do not believe it can be done. These are not the same thing. In 15 years of moving through hill country in Nepal, carrying loads, moving animals, navigating monsoon trails at night, Thapa had developed a kind of fluency with difficult ground that is not available to men who did not grow up on it. He could look at a slope and estimate what it would cost to climb it the way a builder estimates what it will cost to lay a foundation. Methodically, without drama. The western face, in his assessment, would cost them 4 hours in silence. In exchange, it would put them above and behind the eastern bunkers that had killed so many men from the front. His first proposal was refused at company level. The slope was too steep. The vegetation would make noise. If they were heard during the climb, they would be caught in terrain where they could neither advance nor retreat nor return fire effectively. The assessment was not unreasonable. It was also made by men who had not climbed the slope. Thapa had. That same night, with 2 of his men, he had gone up a section of it in the dark. Not to the top. Far enough to understand the bamboo, which was old enough and dense enough that it deadened sound rather than transmitted it, and far enough to identify the rock seams that offered purchase even in the dark, and far enough to confirm what he had suspected from below. The Japanese had not posted sentries on the western face because they had decided it was not a place soldiers would go. He requested again. Refused again. This time at battalion level, with a note that the proposal represented a misuse of Gurkha capabilities and that the approach had been reviewed and eliminated on week 1. What changed was a conversation. A signals officer who had been present for the second refusal mentioned it, almost in passing, to the divisional intelligence officer who had been frustrated for 6 weeks and was running out of deference to conventional assessments. The intelligence officer brought it to the brigadier. The brigadier asked one question. Had anyone actually climbed it? Permission came through on a Tuesday. Thapa did not hold a formal briefing. He walked his platoon commanders to the base of the western face at dusk and showed them what they would climb. He walked them along it left to right and described what he had found and what he expected. He told them where the bamboo thinned and where it was thick enough to hold a man's weight against a slope. He told them about the rock seam at approximately 200 feet that would be the first point of rest. He told them what they would carry. Each man, rifle, 100 rounds, 2 grenades, water, their kukri. No packs, no mortars, no radio. The weight in the antenna would create problems on the slope that could not be solved. If this worked, they would not need the radio. If it did not work, the radio would not help them. Nobody asked if it would work. That for these men was not the kind of question that helped. They moved to the base at 22:15 hours. The moon was behind overcast. The jungle at the foot of the slope smelled of wet stone and old vegetation. Thapa checked each man's equipment himself, not quickly, not perfunctorily, but the way a man checks something he will not be able to check again. Then he went first. The western face of the Bishanpur Ridge took 4 hours and 11 minutes. The bamboo at the lower sections was old growth, thick-stalked, its nodes offering holds that were better than they appeared from below. A man could move through it by pressing rather than pulling, displacing stalks by body weight rather than striking them. It was slow. It was not loud. At roughly 150 feet, the vegetation thinned and the rock became the primary surface. Cold basalt. Smooth in the sections the monsoon had polished for 10,000 years, offering holds only where it had cracked or where roots had forced their way through. Thapa had found these sections during his reconnaissance and memorized the line. He did not hesitate. He moved, and the men behind him followed the same line. Hands finding the same holds, feet pressing the same seams. At 250 feet, a man near the back of the line lost his footing on a wet section and grabbed a bamboo stalk to catch himself. The stalk flexed and struck another. The sound it made was not large. In the jungle at night, sounds travel unpredictably, absorbed in some directions, amplified in others. Every man on the slope froze. 30 seconds. 45. A minute. From above, nothing. No voices, no movement of boots on rock. The Japanese sentries on the eastern side of the ridge were watching the valley. The western face was watching nothing. The man who had slipped found his feet. They kept climbing. The last man came over the ridge crest at 02:26 hours. All 60 men. 60 pounds of equipment each. 4 hours of silence on a face that had been classified impassable. They were above the bunkers. They were inside the perimeter. And they were not finished. Here is where the knife enters. Not as a weapon first, as a signal. At 0440, the eastern sky began to lighten in the way it does in that part of Burma, slowly, without announcement, the darkness becoming slightly less dark, and then less dark again before anything could be called light. Thapa positioned his men. The bunker apertures were below them and to the east. The Japanese inside had been awake through the night, watching the approaches they had prepared, hearing nothing. A Japanese sergeant conducting a pre-dawn check of the ridge perimeter came around the western side at 0451. He stopped. He was close enough that Thapa later said he could hear the man's breathing change. The sergeant had approximately 2 seconds to make a sound before Thapa was on him. The kukri, a blade roughly 18 inches long, slightly forward curved, weighted toward the tip in a way that is specific to its design and specific to the purpose for which it was designed, does not require a large arc to be effective. It requires a precise one. The sergeant did not make a sound. What happened in the next 4 minutes has been described in different ways by the men who were there and in different ways still by the officers who wrote the reports. What the accounts agree on is this. Thapa's platoon moved through the bunker complex from above and behind, and they moved through it with kukris rather than rifles, because in the close quarters of a bunker system at dawn, a rifle is a thing you fire once and then use as a club, and a kukri is a thing you use for as long as you need to. The Japanese 33rd Division had fought in China. They had fought in Malaya. They had fought at Imphal. They were not men who frightened easily. They were not prepared for this. The fighting in the bunker complex lasted 11 minutes. At 05:07, the first Japanese soldier broke from the eastern aperture of the lowest bunker and ran toward his own lines. He was not pursued. More followed. Within 20 minutes, the remaining defenders of the Bishanpur Ridge position, those who were able, had abandoned the bunkers and retreated east. The position that had held for 6 weeks, that had cost the Allies hundreds of casualties across 4 separate organized assaults, had been taken by 60 men climbing a slope everyone agreed could not be climbed, using knives on a position that had been built to stop artillery. When the British company that had been tasked to follow up the Gurkha assault arrived at the base of the ridge at 05:30, they found the position empty. There were white flags on 2 of the bunkers. There was also a Gurkha soldier sitting at the highest point of the ridge, cleaning his kukri with a cloth he had brought for that purpose. He had not been told to bring the cloth. He had simply assumed he would need it. Word travels fast in a siege. By midday, the Japanese units on the 2 adjacent ridges had repositioned their perimeter sentries to include their western faces for the first time. A captured Japanese officer's notebook from this period, recovered 3 weeks later, included a single handwritten line that a translator rendered as, "The Gurkhas do not recognize impossible terrain." It was not meant as a compliment. It was filed as a tactical warning. The British assessment, prepared within a week of the operation, noted that the method of infiltration, using apparently impassable terrain to bypass prepared defensive positions, represented a capability that had not been formally incorporated into the planning process for previous assaults on the feature. It was the military way of saying, we had the answer in front of us for 6 weeks and we did not ask the right people. Subedar Thapa received the Military Cross. The citation described the operation in 3 sentences. It mentioned his personal bravery, his leadership during the assault, and the successful capture of the objective. It did not mention the 3 days of observation, the 2 reconnaissance climbs in darkness, the 2 refusals, or the conversation that eventually changed the brigadier's mind. The citations never mention those parts. There is a specific thing worth understanding about the kukri and the way it was regarded by the British officers who commanded Gurkha units. It was considered in formal tactical doctrine a weapon of last resort, a close quarters implement for situations where the rifle was no longer functional. Some officers went further and regarded it as something between a tool and a symbol, culturally significant to the men who carried it, militarily marginal in an era of automatic weapons and artillery. These were men who had never watched 60 kukris come out of their sheaths at the same time. There is a sound to it, not loud, not dramatic. It has been described by the men who heard it in the dark, in Burma, in Italy, in North Africa, as something closer to a whisper than a clash, dry leather and drawn steel, the sound of a decision already made. The officers who wrote it off as a symbol had misunderstood it in the same way they had misunderstood the western face of the Bishanpur Ridge. They had looked at it and concluded, not useful here, not a factor in a modern engagement. The thing that gets brought out when everything else fails. What the Gurkhas understood, what men who had trained with that blade since childhood understood, was that the knife is not a weapon of last resort. It is a weapon of first resort in specific circumstances. Close quarters. Darkness. Silence required. A bunker system designed to face outward. A position built on the assumption that its enemies will arrive where it expects them. In those circumstances, the kukri is not a symbol. It is the answer. The broader Allied command drew conclusions from the Bishanpur operation. New doctrine was developed around terrain assessment, particularly regarding slopes and approaches previously marked impassable. The specific language that had been used, U for unpassable, was reviewed and revised. What is harder to measure is the other lesson. The one that was not written into doctrine because it is not the kind of thing that fits easily into military manuals. The men who had the solution had been in the briefing room for 2 hours before anyone asked them. They had been there for 6 weeks. Not one of the 4 assault plans had incorporated their specific knowledge of the ground, not because Gurkhas were unavailable for consultation, but because the planning process did not have a mechanism for asking them. A British officer who fought with Gurkha units throughout the Burma campaign wrote about this period in a memoir published in the 1960s. He said something that his editors apparently considered impolite enough to soften, but which survives in his original manuscript. We spent 3 years discovering that the men we had hired to fight for us knew more about fighting in this terrain than we did. We spent those same 3 years failing to ask them. He was writing about Burma, He could have been writing about any mountain, any jungle, any ridge where men who grew up on difficult ground were deployed by men who had only ever studied it from maps. The western face of the Bishanpur Ridge is jungle again. The bunkers are still there, mostly collapsed by decades of monsoon and vegetation, their apertures filled with roots. The road below is paved now. Vehicles move on it freely. There is no plaque. The operation is documented in regimental histories and in the footnotes of larger accounts of the Imphal Kohima campaign. It does not have a name that most people know. It was one operation among hundreds in a theater that was itself overshadowed by the European war in the memory of the countries whose men fought it. What it has is this: a slope that was marked impassable. 60 men who did not accept that marking. A knife that everyone said was a symbol, and that turned out, in 11 minutes on a dark ridge in Burma, to be something considerably more functional than that, and a question that had been sitting unanswered in a briefing room for 6 weeks that required only one moment, one officer willing to stop treating his Gurkha soldiers as a resource to be pointed and start treating them as men who might know something he did not, before it got the answer it had always had. That is not a tactical lesson. Or it is not only a tactical lesson, it is the older one underneath, that the most dangerous assumption is not that the enemy is strong. It is that the men beside you have nothing to teach you. They had something to teach. It took 6 weeks and 4 failed assaults and a brigadier asking a simple question to find out,